Welcome to the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Brian Russell, and it's my great pleasure to have Dr. Mike Voigts back again for round two. Welcome, Mike, and thanks for coming back on my show already.
Oh, thanks, Brian. Great to be with you once again.
And we had a really great conversation. And so if you haven't listened to the previous episode, I think this is going to be standalone, but you're going to want to go back and listen to our first interview where we talked about things like simplicity, the unum necessarium, which is having that one necessary thing, and just about spiritual formation and some of Mike's background. One of the things that we didn't get to, which was ironic because it's your actual specialty, and it was why I wanted you on in the first place, was to talk some about a person that a lot of folks won't know about, Bernard of Clairvaux. Can you give us some quick background on who Bernard was and how he came to play such an important role in your life and what you've learned, and we'll kind of take it from there.
Yeah. He was born in 1090 in France, and Colin Morris has called the 12th century the discovery of the individual. It was a revolutionary time in Western Europe, and so he was born right at a time when people started to take their own faith personally. Not just born into a Christendom culture, but what about me? What about me, the individual? And I was just fascinated with this man when I first learned about him. It was in a class on Thomas Merton, actually, back in seminary, because Bernard was one of the founding fathers of Thomas Merton's monastic order, the Cistercians. And really, some have called Bernard the most influential person in the church in the first half of the 12th century. And so I was just captivated by this man who was called by God to leave the world as a Cistercian monk, but yet he found himself at the end of his life having a lot of regrets because he allowed himself to be drawn into the various scandals and affairs of the world to settle disputes and to bring down heretics and other things, that he really wondered who he was at the end of his life. And when you read his works, you have no idea that conflict was inside of him until you get to his letters. And that's really where I've spent a lot of my research is in his letters, because we really get to see Bernard the man and not Bernard the leader. And there really was a difference there. There's a vulnerability in his letters. So I was just fascinated with this guy. And there aren't very many of us left in the world who have spent our academic careers chasing after this medieval monk. I mean, there's just a handful of us left, I think. But I think what we can discover in him, if we do some good contextualization, are some great lessons for those in ministry today, and lessons for the church.
Well, let's just jump right into that. And I think a lot of our listeners, hopefully we'll have a very wide audience, but for right now, I know it's a lot of pastors. And so, it's intriguing. In his letters, you see his vulnerability side, and we don't want to make this a let's break Bernard down show and make him into a less than Saint Bernard. But at some level, the very fact that he had dropped out, we withdrew intentionally and went to a monastic life and was pulled back in. I mean, anybody that's a pastor knows that tension of how we have to be deeply formed by God, yet every single day trying to serve as the hands, the feet, the mouthpiece of Jesus to other people. So what are maybe some lessons about leadership that we can draw out of Bernard? And then we're going to go obviously deeper into some of the spiritual pieces, but what are some of the lessons, maybe warnings even from his life that you kind of gathered from his letters?
Well, I think what we see in his life, in that even though he had some regrets about how his life ended up, I mean, at the end of his life, he called himself a chimera, a monster. He said, "I still wear the clothes of a monk, but I left that life long ago." But even though he had regrets in his own life, were it not for the interventions he had in the world, he would not have impacted Western Christianity as powerfully as he did. I mean, he was the one who brought heresy charges against Peter Abelard. He was the one who settled the dispute in the 1130s when two people proclaimed themselves as Pope. He settled that. He stopped wars. He was involved in so many different areas. And even though it was a cost to himself personally, the fruit that he left the world had a profound nourishment for others. And you see this in his letters. Just how he could become incensed by certain things, or he could calm people down when they were all stressed. He had this way, and they say this of William Shakespeare. What made him such a great writer is that he understood the human condition, and I think Bernard had that same understanding of what it means to be human. And from all that we know, he never broke his monastic vows, of simplicity and obedience and stability and conversion of manners. He never broke those vows. But he wrote in one of his letters that if anything in the world is a cause of Christ, then it's a concern to me. So there he just thrust himself into the middle of everything, which didn't do himself very well. He was sick a lot of his life, but he just wanted to have an influence in the world because he believed, and some would agree with this, some would not agree with this, that his approach to the Christian life was the right approach.
Yeah, and let's jump right in there. I think this would be an interesting place to ask a question, and maybe you know this, maybe you don't. So in some ways, Bernard is in a situation like many of us are. We may long, like I call this deep dive spirituality. It's because we want to go deep, and we want to be deeply formed as Christians. Yet we also know at some level the gospel comes to us on its way to someone else. So you have this, I don't say it's a tension, but I'm trying to think about spiritual formation and how it relates to mission and leadership. And this seems to be a pressing issue because, part of us, maybe we want to pull away from the world and just be with God. Yet we know that Jesus is always going into the world looking for the lost. And so Bernard seems to, whether at some cost, and he obviously showed some self-awareness in his letters, found himself, maybe thinks he's going to be in a monastery, but he's in the world, or at least knowing what's going on. So do we know what his spiritual practices were? I mean, he had vows, but do we know how he kept himself grounded so he was also able to produce all of these rich sermons and other writings that he had? So what do we know about how he allowed himself to stay centered on Christ while simultaneously getting his hands dirty, you might say?
Yeah. We do know a few things about his life away from the world. Early on, when he was the abbot of Clairvaux Abbey, he would spend hours upon hours every day, almost killing himself physically in deep ascetic prayer. He would not eat, he would not sleep, he would just spend all this time praying. And his bishop finally had to say, time out. You are killing yourself. We need you around. You need to temper that a little bit. So we know that he spent a lot of time every day in solitary contemplative prayer. We know that. We also know that in his engagement with other people, I mean, he was a monk. He was part of a community. He had other people when he allowed them to. He was something of an enigma in some ways. When he allowed people to, especially those who were close to him, he would listen to their counsel. He didn't try to keep his relationship with Christ isolated from others. But that was difficult for him because he was such a leader and he had such confidence that God was speaking through him. Years later, he was called the last of the fathers, the last of the church fathers. And in some ways that's true. His approach to ministry, his approach to the church, his approach to leadership and authority was more in line with the days of the church fathers than in the high Middle Ages. And so he was a little bit out of his time. And so he really wanted to see the church brought back to those days. And he worked tirelessly to do that. But a lot of it, Brian, I think had to do with his calling. He felt so confident. Some would call it arrogance. I wouldn't, because I think he understood himself too well for that. But yeah, he had a confidence that God was speaking through him and that this is what he was put on earth to do. And so he did it. He thought that the renewal of the world would come about by the planting of monasteries all over Europe, because the monks were called to pray for the world. And so he was a medieval church planter. He planted hundreds of what they called churches. We'd call them monasteries all over Europe, hundreds of them. Because he just had this personality that was so engaging that people wanted to be around him and they trusted him. And I think a lot of that came from his own time that he spent in prayer with God and in what he really heard God saying to him. A lot of that is not known because in the monastic tradition, it's not appropriate for one to share a deep spiritual experience with someone else. Just see that as a gift from God to you. Because then if someone else doesn't receive this experience, they may think God's not speaking to them. And so we wouldn't want to cause somebody to stumble in that way. But yeah, everything he did, I think, came from his time that he spent alone with God, away from everybody else, and his calling and his love for Christ. He had such a deep love for Christ. I can't even put it into words.
Well, let me ask you, because this is, to me, this gets to the heart of what I would think is a deep dive. So you've talked about how early on he actually had to have a bishop tell him to chill out a little bit because he was so into silence and solitude. But I'm also, I think, hearing you say that those were formative times for him. So what actually, and I'm thinking about our listeners now. Again, historically, we're in this COVID-19 lockdown, and hopefully by the time everybody's listening to this, it will have passed, but who knows? But we're all in some level, there's opportunities for silence and solitude, depending on how many people you have living with you. But what role does silence play in solitude in the spiritual life? And again, we don't know what happened to Bernard. I'm not going to ask you to share your own experiences per se, but and I do at least 20 minutes of centering prayer every single day. I do a lot of journaling stuff. Again, I'm not going to talk about exactly what I run into when I do those things, but I've seen what it's done in my life on a limited scale, just for the last 5 to 10 years, having the whole piece in here. What is the message of somebody that actually is pulled away and then kind of gotten recalled into the world? What role does silence play as you're sitting there as a professor of spiritual formation, and how do we need to recapture that today?
Well, it's really hard for us today because silence is just something that we either avoid, or it's something that is impossible in our lives because we can sit in a silent room and there's a lot of noise going on in our lives. And I think that for Bernard, especially in his life, and he wrote this in one of his sermons on the Song of Songs, that if anything that we pursue in life, whether it's knowledge or a love for God or simplicity or silence or prayer, if it does not lead to love for other people, then we're just building ourselves up with pride. So for Bernard, those times of prayer that he had, that his love for God did not exist for him. His love for God existed for other people. And I tell my students this all the time. You're in seminary not for yourself. You're not learning all these things for yourself. You're learning them so that other people might grow into a deeper love for Christ. And if you're just trying to get that glorious A on your transcript, then maybe check your intentions for this. Why are you in seminary in the first place? Because it should always lead to our love for others. And I think he had that in his life. Now, what got him in trouble, he was not perfect. I call him a saint whose humanity got in the way. He was not perfect. He would speak into areas where he needed to stay out. He would not have the whole picture of a situation and jump right in and embarrass himself. He was naive a couple of times. So there's a lot we can learn that he thought God was using him in a certain way, but he didn't have the full picture of what was really happening. And so I tend to be the type of personality that jumps off the cliff and then wonders what you did. I'll think about this later. Let's go. But he has allowed me to learn, no, let's take a step back and let's really discern, are these ideas coming from God, or are they coming from my own desire to do things? Or are God's desire for my life and mine the same? So there's a lot of discernment that happens, and I think that discernment can come from the silence that we have in our lives. And not just from having a silent time every day. That's wonderful. We need that. But how can we live in such a way in the day-to-day activities of our lives that we are in this area of silence in our lives? That silence exists in us while we're engaged in a meeting or while we're in a crowd of people. That, I think, is possible. And that's when we start talking about what it means to live a contemplative life. And that I think is what Bernard aspired to be. He wasn't always successful, but I think that's what he thought was possible for everybody. Whether you're in the church or you're a king or you're a peasant, that type of life is possible for you. And he really believed that, I think.
Yeah, I think we can go really deep here. And I know one of my favorite quotations about silence and solitude actually comes from a psychoanalyst who I don't think actually has faith commitments. It's James Hollis, and it's a really good book on kind of midlife and stuff. And he talks about the cure for loneliness is solitude.
Yeah.
And I find that really deep. And I think it actually connects with what we're talking about. And also, I know we need to talk about the 4 levels of love, or that may not be the right wording for what Bernard does, but we talk about growing in love for others, but the kind of the tension spot always is, and again, I'm an amateur Bernard person only because of what I've learned from you, but I've read his famous sermon on the reservoir versus the canal or the channel, and he talks about one of the mistakes that we can make is loving others more than we love ourselves, and how that isn't what God wants. Maybe you can play around with that for a minute, and maybe then introduce the 4 levels of love and what we can learn from that.
Yeah, I think one of his most well-known works, other than his sermons on the Song of Songs, is this text called the Unloving God, and in this short work, he talks about how each person on earth is in one of 4 different degrees of love for God. The first degree of love for God is loving yourself for the sake of yourself. This is someone who does not have faith in God. They live in the world for themselves, what they can get out of the world for themselves. And that doesn't have to be a selfish thing. They are going to focus on taking care of their family, and that's it. But it's all comes back. Then he says that a second degree of love for God is where we love God, but for the sake of ourselves. We love God, but only for what God can bless us with. Thomas Merton called this consolation. You know, we seek these consolations from God. In a modern understanding, we attend worship so that we can feel something. We want to get something out of it. I didn't like those worship songs. Why? Because I didn't connect with them. It's a love for God, but it's focused on ourselves. Well, I have a test coming up, so I better pray. I'm feeling down. I'm feeling low. I should open up the Bible and read. Now, those might be areas of consolation in our lives, and those aren't necessarily evil. But when those are the focus of our relationship with God, then I think we can do better. And unfortunately, I think this is where a lot of North American Protestant Christianity is that we're stuck at this second degree of love for God. Well, the third degree of love for God, Bernard says, is that we love God, but for the sake of God. Lord, I love you, not for anything that I get out of it, but simply because you are who you are. I don't care about anything. I just love you because I love you. It's like an old saint that I know. He says, Mike, he said, all I want to do when I die is kiss the feet of Jesus. I don't care if he throws me into hell. Lord, just let me kiss your feet once.
Wow.
Because he just loves God because of who God is. But Bernard says there's even a deeper love for God that we can experience. And this is where we love ourselves, but for the sake of God. And this, I think, is an understanding of ourselves that we can't even imagine ourselves apart from God. This, he writes, is reserved for very few people, and most may not even touch this love for God until we are in heaven, standing face to face with God. I have discussions with another member of the faculty, a colleague of mine, who says that, yes, this is what Wesley was talking about with Christian perfection, entire sanctification. That's what this degree of love for God is. And I think, yes, maybe to a point. But when we can just not even imagine our lives even existing were it not for God, that's one thing. But to live with the implications of that understanding, that's what's so difficult. And I think he may not even have achieved this in his own life, because for him, this idea was so deep. This is for very few people, but he would never admit it anyway if this is what his love for God was.
I've always found it interesting in these conversations. What I did want to talk about the holiness piece a bit, but I think you answered that. But it's actually interesting that level 1 and level 4, obviously landing in different galaxies, but at some core level similar.
Yes.
So, when I'm always thinking about lessons and trying to build up self-awareness. And obviously, we all would love to say, hey, I'm at level 4. And then maybe the very desire to think we're at level 4 means we're maybe at level 1, right?
Yes, so, right. That's right. That's right.
So what's the difference? I mean, and this gets back to where we're actually even our first conversation. At some level, if we're going to love others, it's love your neighbor as yourself.
Right.
Right. And that seems to be that's the tension point, right? So you can't be the person that God created you to be if you don't love yourself. I mean, you can disagree with that if you want to.
No.
If you love yourself in the wrong way, you actually are loving your false self, right? And so,
I think, I mean, and this is where humility comes into play, because you could not love yourself. You could see all the faults that you have and how you don't line up with other people, and think that you're being humble, but you're really being prideful.
Mhm.
You could think that everyone in the world is better than you are. And that's very prideful, because yourself is at the center of that. You're comparing yourself with other people rather than seeing yourself as God created you. And so when we can love ourselves, not for the sake of ourselves, but when our love for ourselves is based in our love for God, and we see what Scripture says about who God is love, then we're going to see people a little bit differently than if we were loving ourselves for the sake of ourselves.
Wow. Yeah.
And so we can't truly love someone to the depths that is humanly possible for us to love them until we love ourselves, and that love for ourselves has its foundation in our love for God.
And we can kind of see where, as Wesleyans, that idea of growth and grace would fit into this. What do you think about? I'm always trying to think about different angles on and how to, and I like to compartmentalize things too, which is one of the great dangers. But we already saw how Bernard, in some levels, was divided, and again, we have to live in different spheres. Do you think it's possible to think about these four loves, and that perhaps we're at different levels for certain parts of our lives? So like maybe, and this would be places where we grow. So like maybe in my vocation, maybe I'm level 2 or level 3, way I treat my family. Maybe I'm just at level 1, is there any value in recognizing that perhaps you could move in different angles? Or did Bernard actually just see this? You're either a 4 or you're not. You're either a 3 or you're not. Because it seems like this could be a place where, with some real self-awareness and reflection, we could see growth in different parts of our lives. Or am I just completely misunderstanding what?
I think he would say that it's a holistic approach, that there's consistency in all areas of our lives. There's a consistency in who I am when I'm sitting alone with God, just as there's when I'm with my family, or when I'm engaged in vocational ministry, or when I'm shopping at Kroger. I mean, there's a consistency there. So either we love God for the sake of God in our entire lives, in the entirety of our lives, or we don't. I don't think he would compartmentalize those. I think he would say who you are is who you are. And if there's one area of your life that is struggling, but you're a different person somewhere else, what does that say about the person that you think is so holy when you're somewhere else? Is that authentic or not?
Can you say more about that? Because again, I don't mind being the guinea pig on this whole thing. If I look at my own life, I don't have any deep harbored thing that I need to confess publicly, but I do know that certain parts of my life, it's a lot easier to be the hands, the feet, and the mouthpieces of Jesus than other places. And I know just from myself and from my journaling that I've seen things come up that really bother me in certain areas. And so, again, I'm just maybe I'm just being self-centered, being level 1 here, but I'm just always curious, because obviously our goal is, I always think my one and only goal was his image in my soul. That's an old Keith Green song I really like. But, there's certain places you put me in a certain context, and sometimes it's a lot harder to be Christ-like. And does that mean I'm inauthentic? Maybe I am.
No, I wouldn't say that you're inauthentic. Although if I thought you were, I'd tell you, because you're a good friend.
Yeah, I know.
But I mean, I've been there too. There are times when I was a pastor, for example, when I was absolutely exhausted, and the one person who is the most needy person in the congregation would call me and say, "I have to see you right now." And I wasn't feeling very pastoral in those moments. But I think having a constant awareness of the presence of Christ in your life can help us in those frustrating situations, have a greater perspective of that situation than we can merely have on our own.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful to say it like that. And that's kind of what I was hoping to get for our audience, because sometimes we start talking about these people and it just seems everything's unattainable. And again, level 4 sounds like something that's we have all eternity to grow into that, because it's talking about growing in love. And in a sense, maybe you may find out there's level 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, because I think love is infinite. So in a sense, our all eternity is going to be learning how to love God more profoundly, learning how to love neighbor more profoundly, learning to love the self more profoundly. So that's really good.
And for pastors, the danger that I've seen in my consultation with folks over the years is that they see their relationship with Christ as part of their job description. Well, I have to love God. I'm a pastor. Well, that is a very self-serving. That's a first degree of love for God right there. And when we can separate a pastoral call from our love for God, when we can see our relationship with Christ as not just part of our description of what it means to be in ministry, then I think it gives us the freedom and the capacity, really, to have a divine awareness in every ministry situation, even those frustrating situations. It just gives us a peace. Yes, that person's always going to complain about the temperature in the sanctuary. But Jesus, you died for them and you love them and I love them too. And I've got my own quirks.
And we know
it just gives us a different perspective of ourselves, I think.
No, I think that's helpful. Just as you move forward from Bernard, I mean, you talked about Thomas Merton, and maybe you can say a few words about him. But you're also a lay Cistercian, right? So, and you get to.
I am.
So, what have you learned from being a lay Cistercian? I guess you should explain what that is before you answer this. But
Thomas Merton actually started this. He wrote in one of his books that there ought to be a way for people outside the walls of a monastery to live a monastic life in society. What might that look like? So it started at Gethsemane, and now it's an international group of the Cistercian order. And we meet monthly. And we make a commitment. We go through a period of 2 years of formation like the monks do. And we are accountable to each other. And our goal is to live this contemplative life out in the real world. And so we have what's called a plan of life where we contextualize the 3 monastic vows of stability, obedience, and conversion of manners. And it's for me, it's a tremendously rewarding group because it's outside of the Wesleyan tradition that I'm so a part of, but it's with people who have just as deep a love for Christ as Wesleyans do. And it just gives me a different perspective, different insights into the Christian life that have been very, very helpful for me. And so they've used this poor little Protestant boy in lots of different ways. And I helped write a formation guide for those who are going to make a commitment, and I'm part of the spiritual direction team for the lay Cistercians, and it's just been incredibly rewarding for me, just a real blessing, and just to have the privilege of being invited into the monastery once a month and to sit around the table with monks and with lay people and just talk about what it means to live a faithful life. And I'll tell you, the word holiness comes up a lot around that table. It's wonderful.
So maybe this is a good kind of last question, then I'm going to ask you a couple quick ones here at the end again. But so if our goal is to be the hands, feet, mouthpiece of Jesus in the world, and most of our listeners, I'm going to guess every single listener is not living in a monastery and has moved away from everyone. What lessons can we learn from what you've learned as a lay Cistercian? Or maybe what would be some questions that we could be asking ourselves? Not that we want to join a monastic order like you have, but you've obviously gotten real fruit from that. And these are persons who have a long tradition and are thinking deeply about what's it look like to essentially impact our world for Jesus. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that gets me excited. So what would it mean to be a monk, if you will, living in an urban area, a suburb, or even a rural area? What are some pieces that we can take with us back into the world that would help us to be better pastors, better Christians?
That's a great question. And I think it's different for each person based on our different personalities and our interests and our temptations and our giftedness. I think to start, there needs to be an understanding of simplicity, which we are in an incredibly complex society. We allow more images and text and audio into our minds than we realize. We get in the car, first thing we do is turn on the radio, or it's probably already turned on because of the last time we drove. We wake up in the morning, a lot of people just turn the TV on. You can't have a quiet existence. And we want to obtain more and more things to simplify our lives. Whereas we need to get rid of things to simplify our lives. And a lot of Christians, at least in North America that I've met, don't know how to simplify their lives, and they have no desire to, because they like too much of what the world has to offer. The world has some engaging, fun things to offer that are not sinful.
Or at least it used to, right?
Yeah, right. But do we really need those things in our lives?
Yeah.
Because the more we have in our lives, the less focus we have on God. And so that, I think, is the foundation. Don't just add things, get rid of things in your life. If there's anything in your life that you have or that's a priority to you that doesn't draw you closer to Christ, why would you want it in your life in the first place? And that, I think, is the first level of the main foundation for living this monastic or contemplative life in modern society. That you can live a life of simplicity when you're in a crowd of people or walking through the mall. It just depends on where our focus is, where our desires are. What is it we're trying to get out of life?
Can I ask you to clarify one thing and see?
Yeah, please.
Because I think some language, sometimes when you hear that, what you just said, it sounds like, oh, I just have to deny myself, which is like we just come out of Lent while we're recording this. And I wondered, again, I have no problem with denial language and surrender language, but is it the way you described it? Would you think the word getting to the point where you're not attached to things is different than denying yourself from things?
Yeah, or yes, we're not attached. We're actually freeing ourselves from things.
Yeah. So
that's even better.
Okay.
I mean, we're not denying ourselves. We're freeing ourselves from it.
Yeah. Okay. That's
oh my goodness. I was on a retreat at the monastery once, and it was football season, and my college football team was playing prime time, and I was able to access it on Wi-Fi in the monastery library. So here I am watching on my little phone a football game in the monastery with my headphones on, and they cut the Wi-Fi off at 8:00. And my screen goes black because there's no cell service out there. And I'm frustrated. And I'm thinking, I am such an idiot because I came to the Abbey to free myself from these things, and I find myself chained to them. Why is college football so important to me? And it was a wonderful lesson. wonderful lesson of the things that we think are not doing us harm actually are, because we think that we can't live without them. When, as Jesus tells us, Lord, give us our daily bread, just the things we need every day. And so I don't see that as denying ourselves from the world. I think in the more stuff we have, the more we're denying ourselves of really being ourselves.
It's good. It's good. I didn't mean to interrupt that thought, but I wanted to.
No, that's great.
That was really helpful the way you described that. And in a sense, once you get to the point of non-attachment of really everything other than our devotion to Christ, that actually frees you up. Because some people think, oh, geez, I have to simplify. I'm never going to get to enjoy anything. And I know that, you have things that you enjoy, I have things, but in a sense, when you're non-attached, you can actually enjoy things more, like the football game. There's nothing wrong with watching a football game, but when it becomes like, oh my God, I gotta watch.
Yeah. Or I love photography.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I love doing photography, but why would I think that the camera that I have is not good enough and I need a nicer one? Just because the technology has improved. I mean, we trap ourselves that way.
Yeah, it's really good. It's good. Well, this has been fantastic. I feel like we can keep going, but I want to be fair to your time. I want to ask you, again, remind everybody where they can find you online. I'll post all the things in the notes again. So tell us about your website, your Twitter account again.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Mike Voigts, Voigts. And I have a little blog where I put some of my photography and my drone footage and little articles I write. It's clairvaux.me, Clairvaux from Clairvaux, .me. And I would love to connect with folks.
And if folks want to dig a little bit more into Bernard of Clairvaux, you've mentioned his sermons, his letters, and his treatise on loving God. And I can put some notes there. Are there any particular sermons that maybe you would suggest people jump into that would be obvious places to get your feet wet?
Yes. Sermon 36 on the Song of Songs is a tremendous sermon on the acquisition of knowledge and our motivations. Of course, Unloving God is free online. You can find that online. It's free. There are so many great texts that he has, but those are great places to start, especially on Loving God. It's a very simple book. Steps of Humility and Pride was written early in his life, and that's just a very simple book on how to keep things simple in your life, and not out of control.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for who you are, for what you do, and for being willing to share this knowledge with the world and bring in a guy that lived. It's amazing that somebody lives almost 1,000 years ago. It just sounds so relevant today. So thank you for your work, for honoring God's call in your life, and for being on Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations with me today. Well,
it's an honor, Brian. I think what you're doing with this blog is just a tremendous gift to the world. So I just pray that more and more folks will be able to hear this and hear from the wisdom that you have, because you've been through a lot in your life and God has shown you a lot of things. And so thanks for having me on here. I'm very honored.
Well, you're very welcome. And I'm going to try to be non-attached to all the results and statistics for this thing as much as I possibly can.
Don't be chained to them. Free yourself from them.
Well, looking at my high-tech background just keeps me very humble here. About
that's
here too. So
that's a very simple background there. I'm very proud of you for that, Brian.
Oh yeah. Well, you're welcome. Well, everybody, thanks for checking out this episode. Tell your friends, and until next time, live by faith, be known by love, and be voices of hope in a world that desperately needs it. Amen.